How could something so dark happen inside a respected family's home? A home everyone thought they knew. Why were three young sisters found dead? And their father sitting beside them with a gun in his hand. And the most haunting question of all, who was the real monster inside that house? June 18, 1978. The small town of Willow Creek, tucked among Vermont's soft green hills, was sweltering under a rare early summer heat wave. By 10 in the morning, the air had turned heavy and wet, clinging to skin and weighing down every breath like a damp blanket. Thermometers pushed past 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and a shimmering haze hovered over the quiet streets. From open kitchen windows came the sound of Bee Gees' Night Fever, mixing with the smell of freshly cut grass and morning coffee. At the Willow Creek Theater, posters for Grease promised a cool escape from the suffocating heat. Pickup trucks and glossy sedans, Chevys, Fords, Pontiacs, lined up at the Shell station on Main Street, their chrome details catching the sunlight like mirrors. American flags still fluttered from porch rails after the recent Independence Day celebrations. Willow Creek was the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Neighbors greeted each other by name. Kids rode their bikes until sunset. Doors stayed unlocked. It was a picture of small-town safety, suspended somewhere between the past and the present, where people believed that real evil belonged to faraway cities, not to them. At the heart of this postcard town stood the Hargrave House, a white two-story home with dark green shutters and a wide wraparound porch. Robert Hargrave, the patriarch, was the branch manager of the local bank, a respected man in the community and an active member of the church. 5 years earlier, his wife Linda had died of cancer, leaving Robert to raise their 3 daughters alone. Claire, 22, was the responsible one. She was finishing her education degree and planned to begin teaching at Willow Creek Elementary that fall. Julia, 20, quiet and observant, was devoted to photography. She spent hours developing pictures in the darkroom she had built in the basement. Anna, 17, was the family's musical prodigy, preparing for auditions at a prestigious music academy. Neighbors described the Hargraves as a family that had endured tragedy with grace. Robert tended the garden every Saturday. His daughters chased their ambitions. Life inside that house seemed steady, even hopeful, a symbol of resilience after loss. That Saturday morning, however, something felt off. Mrs. Whitaker, the elderly woman who lived next door, noticed the house was strangely still. Normally, by this hour, she would hear the piano drifting through the open windows or see Robert trimming hedges in the yard. But now the curtains were drawn tight. The mailbox was crammed with letters. Several newspapers lay scattered at the doorstep, yellowing in the heat. She climbed the wooden steps to the porch, rang the doorbell, and waited. Nothing. She knocked harder. Silence. Pressing her face to the side window, she saw only darkness inside. A chill ran through her despite the oppressive heat. Mrs. Whitaker circled the house slowly, calling out, "Robert? Girls?" But the only reply was the rhythmic drone of cicadas in the thick summer air. Her unease grew heavier with every step. She hurried back to her kitchen, lifted the receiver of her rotary phone, and dialed the local police station. Less than an hour later, a black and white Ford Crown Victoria rolled down Maple Street, its engine humming in the heat. 2 officers stepped out, wiping sweat from their brows as they approached the quiet house. They had no idea that behind those shuttered windows waited a scene so grim. It would shake Willow Creek to its core and haunt the town for decades. The 2 patrol officers approached the Hargrave house slowly, their boots creaking against the wooden porch. The curtains were drawn so tightly that not a sliver of light escaped. One of them knocked on the door again, calling out, "Willow Creek Police, Mr. Hargrave." Only silence answered, heavy and unmoving, as if the house itself were holding its breath. After a quick exchange over the radio, they received authorization to force entry. With a solid shoulder hit, the front door gave way, swinging inward with a dry groan. The first thing that hit them wasn't what they saw. It was what they smelled. A dense, sickly sweet odor rolled out like a physical force, an unmistakable blend of rot and something metallic underneath. The officer in front instinctively raised a hand to his face, gagging. The air inside was thick and unmoving, as if the house had been sealed for days. Somewhere, a fly buzzed lazily, circling in the stale heat. They stepped into the living room, flashlights cutting through the dimness. Dust particles floated like tiny ghosts. On the far side of the room, in front of the flickering television set, a zenith console with a wooden frame, sat the body of Robert Hargrave. He was slumped in his favorite armchair, head tilted to the side. .38 revolver rested on the floor beside his limp hand. On the coffee table lay a half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels and a tumbler with a few inches of amber liquid left inside. In his right hand, stiffened by rigor mortis, he clutched a framed photograph of his late wife, Linda, smiling in the faded sunlight of some happier day. The walls seemed to close in around the officers. This wasn't a burglary. This was something else. They cleared the first floor quickly. Empty kitchen, spotless hallway, no signs of forced entry. But the dread in their stomachs told them the real horror waited upstairs. As they ascended the narrow staircase, the stench intensified. One officer paused, hand gripping the banister, gathering the nerve to continue. The door to the first bedroom creaked open slowly. Claire's room. She lay neatly in her bed, covers pulled up to her chest, eyes closed as if she had drifted off to sleep, except for the dark, dried stains spreading across her nightgown and the small wound just above her heart. Her hair was still combed, hands resting at her sides. Julia was found in the second room, surrounded by the photographs she had pinned to the walls. Landscapes, portraits, fragments of a life that ended too soon. Her camera sat on the desk, a roll of undeveloped film beside it. She too was in bed, shot once in the chest. The image was eerily peaceful, like someone had staged a tableau rather than committed a crime. The last room belonged to Anna. The piano downstairs had always carried her melodies through the neighborhood. Now, upstairs, she lay in silence, the same single fatal wound in her chest. On the nightstand beside her was an open sheet of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It looked as if she had set it down only moments ago. On the kitchen table downstairs, tucked beneath a stack of unopened mail, the officers discovered a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "I can't live with what I've done. I don't deserve forgiveness. My girls are with Linda now. That's where they belong." Signed, Robert Hargrave. The house filled quickly with more people. Flashing lights, police cars lining the quiet street, neighbors gathering behind yellow tape. Police Chief Frank Dawson arrived 20 minutes later. Stocky, gray-haired, and seasoned by nearly 3 decades on the force, Dawson had seen his share of tragedy. But as he walked through the rooms, even he paused. The scene was too methodical, too silent, too heavy with unanswered questions. Dr. Sylvia Ramirez, the county medical examiner, crouched over Robert's body, her practiced eyes scanning for time of death indicators. She moved upstairs and repeated the same routine for each daughter. Her preliminary estimate was grim. The deaths had occurred 2 to 3 days earlier. In the heat, decomposition had set in quickly. By that evening, the official narrative began to form. The note, the gun, the positioning of the bodies. To outsiders, it looked straightforward. A father, broken by grief and guilt, killed his 3 daughters before turning the gun on himself. But outside, under the fading orange sky, the residents of Willow Creek gathered in stunned silence. This was Robert Hargrave, a man they trusted, a family they admired. The Hargrave house had always been a symbol of resilience. Now it was a crime scene. The same porch where they'd once waved to the girls on their way to school was now wrapped in yellow tape, guarded by uniformed officers. No one said it out loud, but everyone thought the same thing. If something this horrific could happen here, inside that house, it could happen anywhere. Detective Michael Grant arrived at the Hargrave house 2 hours after the first officers had secured the scene. He'd been with the department for only 6 months, transferred from a larger city after years of working violent crimes. Willow Creek was supposed to be a slower pace, a place where the worst cases involved drunken fights or the occasional burglary. What he saw that day didn't fit the town, and it didn't sit right with him either. Grant studied the scene carefully. The note found on the kitchen table was the first thing that caught his eye. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. Not the kind of clean, confident script people remembered from Robert Hargrave's signature at the bank. "I can't live with what I've done," it read, but something about it felt forced. Not just emotionally, physically. The letters were inconsistent, as if the hand that wrote them had been trembling or mimicking. Then there was the arrangement of the daughters' bodies. All three were found lying in bed, each with a single gunshot wound to the chest, blankets neatly pulled up. Grant had investigated enough shootings to know that violence rarely looked so tidy. Real scenes were chaotic, struggle, panic, blood spatter in unpredictable places. This looked more like staging than murder in the heat of emotion. The revolver itself raised another flag. Crime scene technicians had dusted it for fingerprints and found only smeared partials. Not a single clear print belonging to Robert Hargrave. If he'd fired 4 shots and then turned the gun on himself, there should have been clear impressions. Instead, it looked wiped down. Grant began knocking on doors. Neighbors spoke of the Hargraves as the model family. Robert was respected, kind, devoted to his daughters. Claire was focused and dependable, Julia creative and quiet, Anna full of talent. No one could imagine him harming them. But as he pressed gently, small cracks appeared in the perfect facade. One neighbor recalled that Anna had recently stopped playing piano as often. Her usual afternoon melodies had abruptly gone silent weeks earlier. A teacher mentioned Julia seemed distracted and withdrawn near the end of the school year, turning in work late for the first time. Another neighbor, lowering her voice, said she'd seen the eldest daughter crying alone on the porch late at night more than once. None of it was enough to build a case, but it planted unease in Grant's mind. Something had been happening inside that house, something no one had dared to speak about. Unfortunately, the tools to dig deeper simply didn't exist in 1978. DNA analysis was still years away. Fingerprint databases were slow, paper-based. Psychological profiling was in its infancy. Without physical evidence contradicting the suicide note and the weapon, Grant had little to challenge the official story. By late autumn, the case was formally closed as a murder-suicide. Reports were filed. Evidence was boxed and shelved in the basement of the police station. The Hargrave house was eventually sold. But Michael Grant couldn't shake the feeling that they had missed something, that the truth of what happened inside those walls was darker and far more complex than the files suggested. He moved on to other cases, but the Hargrave murders would haunt him quietly for the rest of his career. In the months following the tragedy, Willow Creek tried to return to normal, but the Hargrave house stood like a scar on the town's otherwise placid face. The white paint began to peel. The porch steps creaked louder. Families passing by would lower their voices. Children would glance at the shuttered windows with a mix of fear and fascination, and older residents would shake their heads, repeating the official story as if trying to convince themselves it was true. Not everyone accepted that story. Margaret Rivers, Linda Hargrave's cousin, and her husband Thomas were among the few who refused to believe Robert had murdered his daughters and taken his own life. Margaret had grown up with Linda. She'd known Robert for decades. "He wasn't perfect," she would say quietly to friends, "but he wasn't a monster." When the police closed the case, Margaret didn't. Every year, on the anniversary of the murders, a small notice appeared in the Willow Creek Chronicle. Always the same words. "We remember Claire, Julia, and Anna. We love you. We will not stop searching for the truth." It became a kind of ritual. Some townspeople found it touching. Others thought it was a refusal to let go. But Margaret didn't care. In her home, a modest one-story house on the edge of town, one room slowly transformed into a personal archive. The walls were covered with photographs of the Hargrave sisters, school portraits, candid snapshots, piano recitals, Julia's black and white prints. On a low shelf sat a box filled with newspaper clippings, letters she'd written to the police and the district attorney, copies of reports she had managed to obtain, and personal notes she scribbled late at night when a thought wouldn't let her sleep. She kept everything meticulously labeled and dated. The years passed and Willow Creek changed. Chain stores replaced family-run shops on Main Street. New subdivisions spread into the fields. The gazebo in the town square, where the marching band had once played Sunday afternoons, was torn down to make way for parking. The world moved on. But Margaret didn't. Neither did a handful of older residents who still remembered the sisters' faces. At church services, their names would sometimes be whispered in prayers. Teenagers growing up in the 1980s heard the story in fragments, passed around at sleepovers, told as cautionary tales. That's the house where the father killed them all. Over time, the details blurred, but the core of it lingered like a low, steady hum beneath the surface of everyday life. Thomas passed away in the early 1990s, but Margaret continued their quiet mission alone. Her handwriting grew shakier, her hair turned silver, but every June she mailed that notice to the newspaper. She added new notes to her files whenever she heard a scrap of information, no matter how small. She wasn't an investigator. She had no formal training. What she had was time, grief, and an unshakable instinct that the story everyone accepted was wrong. By the time the 21st century approached, Margaret's living room archive had grown into a shrine, a quiet place where memory refused to die, even as the town around it changed beyond recognition. By the summer of 2020, more than 4 decades had passed since the Hargrave murders. But for Ethan Cole, the story had never been just another piece of town folklore. He had grown up hearing it at his mother's kitchen table. His mother, Susan, had been Claire Hargrave's closest friend in high school. She'd moved to California after the tragedy, determined to build a new life far away from the shadow of Willow Creek. But the story of the 3 sisters had followed her like an echo. Ethan had listened to her stories since he was a boy. At first, they were vague, whispers about a house where something terrible happened. As he grew older, she told him more. She described the sisters' laughter, the sound of Anna's piano drifting through the summer air, and the day she got the phone call that changed everything. The story shaped him in quiet ways. It was one of the reasons he became a detective, specializing in cold cases, drawn to the puzzles that time tried to bury. When his mother passed away in early 2020, Ethan found himself sitting alone with her old photographs. In one, Claire stood with Susan outside the Willow Creek diner, both of them beaming at the camera. In another, all 3 sisters smiled on the Hargrave porch, unaware of the darkness waiting ahead. On the back of one photo, his mother had written, "If anyone can find the truth someday, it'll be you." He decided to honor that promise. A few weeks later, Ethan drove into Willow Creek for the first time in years. The town had changed, new storefronts, wider roads, but the hills were the same, and the air held that same quiet heaviness he remembered from childhood visits. His first stop was the Willow Creek Police Department, a squat brick building with peeling paint and the faint smell of mildew inside. Down in the basement archives, among rows of dusty shelves, he found what he was looking for. A cardboard file box labeled Hargrave, 1978. Inside were brittle photographs from the scene, faded typewritten reports, handwritten witness statements, and copies of the coroner's notes. Coffee stains marked several pages. Some corners had been gnawed by time. Ethan laid everything out on a table under a buzzing fluorescent light. The photographs were stark. Robert slumped in his chair, the 3 girls in their beds, the note on the kitchen table. He had worked dozens of homicide scenes in his career, and even with just these old black and white prints, something felt off. He traced the outlines with his eyes, sensing that the truth was hidden in plain sight. Next, he visited Margaret Rivers. She was well into her 80s now, frail but sharp. Her home smelled faintly of old books and lavender. The archive room she had built over the decades was exactly as meticulous as he'd imagined. When he explained who he was and why he'd come, her eyes welled up. "I always hoped someone would," she whispered. She disappeared for a moment into another room and returned holding a yellowed envelope with careful hands. "This," she said, "belonged to Julia. She gave it to me a week before." Her voice trailed off. "I never opened it. I thought maybe someone else would know what to do." Inside the envelope was a small leather-bound diary, the pages worn and slightly warped with age. On the first page, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Private." Do not read. Ever. Ethan turned the book over in his hands. He had worked hundreds of cases, but holding Julia's diary felt different. This wasn't just evidence. This was a voice frozen in time, waiting to be heard. For the first time in decades, the Hargrave case was stirring again. Ethan sat at the small wooden table in his motel room, the diary lying open in front of him. The leather cover creaked softly each time he turned a page. Outside, summer insects buzzed in the night air, and a neon sign from the gas station across the road flickered through the thin curtains. He adjusted the lamp, took a breath, and began to read. The early entries were ordinary, even sweet. Julia wrote about school dances, photography projects, small arguments with her sisters, and late-night talks in their shared bedrooms. She mentioned their father, Robert, with a kind of careful distance, admiration mixed with formality. She described Claire as responsible, Anna as brilliant but fragile, and herself as the quiet one, the one behind the camera. Then came the entry about Linda's illness. The tone shifted abruptly. Julia's sentences became shorter, fragmented. She wrote about the fear of hospitals, the smell of antiseptic, the quiet at the dinner table after visiting their mother's bedside. When Linda died, Julia wrote simply, "The house is too big now. It echoes." After that, the diary grew darker. She described her father starting to drink heavily in the evenings. At first, it was just sadness. She wrote, like watching someone dissolve slowly. But then came the night that changed everything. One short, half-finished entry stopped Ethan cold. He came into my room. He was drunk. He said I looked like Mom. I can't write this. The next few pages were filled with erratic handwriting, crossed-out words, and long stretches where Julia simply wrote dates, as if she couldn't bear to put the memories into language. Slowly, she began to describe how their father's behavior escalated, first with her, then with her sisters. She wrote about the way Claire started locking her door at night, about how Anna became quiet, her piano playing turning mechanical and hollow. Julia's voice on the page felt both raw and restrained, as if she was writing to survive rather than confess. She mentioned overhearing their father crying in the hallway, then turning violent the next day. She described the way he would blame them for making him feel this way, twisting guilt into control. One entry, dated almost exactly 3 years before the murders, read, "He says we're the only ones who can keep this family together now. That Mom would want it this way. He makes it sound like love, but it feels like a cage." Ethan's hands tightened around the diary as he read the final section. The handwriting grew more hurried, urgent. Julia wrote that Claire had discovered she was pregnant. She didn't say the words outright, but the implication was unmistakable. Anna had attempted to end her own life shortly after. Julia wrote that she found her in time. The last few entries were chillingly calm. They were written like plans, not confessions. "We can't live like this anymore. Claire says it's the only way to protect each other. He'll never stop. If the world won't save us, we have to save ourselves." Julia didn't spell out the plan in full, but the tone was final. There was no hope for escape through ordinary means. She ended her final entry 3 days before the murders with a single sentence. "Forgive us, Mom." Ethan closed the diary slowly. His chest felt heavy, not with shock, but with the quiet weight of confirmation. The whispers, the unease, the things left unsaid in old interviews. It had all been real. The Hargrave tragedy wasn't just a family breaking under grief. It was a slow, hidden horror that had gone unnoticed for years. The room around him was silent, but Julia's voice lingered, trapped in the pages, demanding to be heard. For the first time, Ethan understood. The truth was far worse than anyone had ever imagined. Ethan didn't sleep much after finishing Julia's diary. By the next morning, he was back on his laptop, contacting labs he'd worked with on other cold cases. Margaret had given him several personal items from the sisters' belongings. Old hairbrushes, a toothbrush, a sweater Claire had worn constantly. She had kept them sealed in a box for decades, almost as if she'd known one day someone would need them. Weeks later, the DNA results came back. The tests confirmed what Julia's diary had implied. Claire had been pregnant at the time of her death. Even more disturbing was the paternity result, Robert Hargrave. Ethan stared at the report, feeling the weight of it settle over him like cold fog. This was no longer just suspicion preserved in faded ink. It was scientific proof. He turned next to the old photographs from the crime scene, scanning them at high resolution and sending them to forensic specialists he trusted. The analysts noted inconsistencies almost immediately. The blood spatter on the walls and bedding didn't match the sequence described in the original report. In several of the photos, the angle of Robert's gunshot wound didn't align with typical suicide trajectories. And there were strange gaps, places in the rooms that seemed deliberately left out of the original documentation. One detail especially caught Ethan's eye. In a handful of Julia's personal photographs taken shortly before the murders, there were several shots of the basement. The angles were odd, low, tilted, almost like she had been trying to capture something hidden in the corner of a frame. In the background of one image, behind a stack of shelves, he noticed the edge of what looked like a metal box set into the wall. Curiosity turned into a lead. He tracked down the current owners of the Hargrave house, the Anderson family, who had bought it in the early 2000s. They agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to let him look around, though their unease was obvious. The house had been remodeled over the years, but the basement remained largely untouched. Downstairs, the air was cool and faintly damp. A large wooden bookshelf stood against the far wall, filled with board games and old tools. Ethan ran his hand along the edges, then gave it a firm pull. It shifted slightly, revealing a narrow cavity in the brick. Inside, covered in decades of dust, was a rusted metal box about the size of a shoebox. Its lock had corroded with time, and after a few minutes with a screwdriver, Ethan pried it open. Inside were two things: a bundle of photographs and a single Scotch cassette tape with the words, Evidence 061778, scrawled in black marker. The photographs were horrifying. They showed Robert with his daughters in ways that left no room for doubt. These were not family portraits, they were evidence of long-hidden crimes. Ethan placed them back carefully, his hands steady but his stomach tight. He then found an old tape player at the police station archives and pressed play. At first, there was only static, then the sound of three young female voices, Claire, Julia, and Anna. They were whispering urgently, making a plan. Julia's voice was the clearest. "We'll put the sleeping pills in his whiskey. Once he's out, Claire takes the gun. Anna will write the note. It has to look like he did it himself." Then Claire's voice, firm but trembling. "No one can ever know the truth. If they find out, they'll never see us as anything but victims. Or worse." And then softly, Anna, "We'll leave that night. California. No one will find us." The tape clicked off abruptly. Ethan sat in the empty archive room, the hum of the old fluorescent lights above him. He'd found proof, not just of abuse but of intent, of a desperate plan that had gone terribly wrong. The truth was beginning to surface, cold and methodical, like bones rising through the earth after a long winter. Ethan traced Veronica Moore through a series of old employment records and church directories. She had worked for the Hargrave family for years after Linda's death, then disappeared from Willow Creek shortly after the murders. Eventually, he found her name on the roster of a nursing home just outside Boston, Sunny Valley Retirement Residence. When he arrived, the building was quiet, surrounded by trees, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. A nurse led him down a corridor to a small room near the end. Veronica Moore was in her late 80s now. Her hair was white and thin. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her blanket, but her blue eyes were startlingly sharp. On the nightstand beside her bed stood a faded photograph. A younger Veronica smiling alongside Linda Hargrave, both women leaning toward each other, their faces alight with warmth. "I knew someone would come eventually," she said softly when Ethan introduced himself. "It's been 42 years. I thought maybe no one cared anymore." He explained why he was there, how he'd reopened the case, how Julia's diary and the tape had changed everything. Veronica listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed somewhere far away, as if replaying memories she'd buried long ago. "I loved Linda," she said finally, her voice trembling but clear. "Not just as a friend. She was everything. Robert didn't deserve her. And when she died, I stayed for the girls. Someone had to protect them. But I wasn't strong enough." She told Ethan how she had begun to notice the signs not long after Linda's funeral. Julia's sudden withdrawal, Claire's forced composure, Anna's fear of being alone at night. She remembered how Robert would linger outside their bedrooms under the pretense of saying goodnight, how the girls began to shrink into themselves, their laughter replaced by a kind of quiet, brittle politeness. "I confronted him once," she whispered. "He laughed, said I didn't understand what it meant to keep a family together. After that, I knew. I started staying later in the evenings, trying to keep him from going upstairs. But I couldn't be there every night." Then her voice dropped lower. "A few days before it happened, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. The girls. They were scared. They were planning to end it. To stop him. I should have gone to the police, but who would have believed me back then? A housekeeper. A woman in love with another woman. They would have called me hysterical or sinful. So instead," she hesitated, tears welling in her eyes, "I decided to help them." She explained how she gave Julia a bottle of her prescription sleeping pills, telling her to crush them and put them in Robert's whiskey. "They said they'd leave that night. I believed them," she said. "I parked my car a block away and waited. I was going to drive them wherever they wanted. California. Anywhere." Her hands clenched the blanket. "But they never came out. Hours passed. I saw the upstairs light turn on, then off. Then I heard the first gunshot. I froze. I couldn't move. I told myself it wasn't what it sounded like. And then," her voice broke. "Then the silence. And I drove away before the police came." The room fell quiet. Ethan watched her, seeing both the weight of guilt and the stubborn clarity in her eyes. "I should have saved them," she whispered. "I should have done more. But I was a coward. I thought I was helping. I thought it would all end differently." Ethan recorded her statement, though he sensed she was holding something back. There were gaps. Moments when her gaze drifted and her sentences trailed off. But what she revealed filled in crucial pieces of the puzzle. As he left the nursing home, the sun was setting, and the sky over Boston burned deep orange. He knew the story wasn't finished. Veronica Moore had given him a key. But behind her confession, he felt the shadow of something even darker still waiting to be uncovered. Back in his motel room, Ethan played the cassette again. He had already listened to it dozens of times. But something about Veronica's story gnawed at him. He closed his eyes, tuning out everything except the sound. The girls' voices were clear, urgent whispers, hurried planning. But underneath them, faint, almost buried in the tape's static, was something else. A whisper. A woman's voice. It was subtle, like a breath grazing the microphone. "You have to do this. It's the only way." Ethan sat up straight. He rewound and played it again, this time through audio software on his laptop, filtering out noise and isolating frequencies. The whisper grew clearer with each adjustment. It wasn't one of the sisters. It was older, calm, almost guiding. He sent the cleaned audio to a forensic voice analyst he trusted. 2 days later, the results came back. The voice matched Veronica Moore's with near certainty. The timbre, the cadence, even the slight rasp on the vowels was identical. Ethan returned to the nursing home, his recorder in his pocket, determination in his stride. Veronica was sitting near the window, the evening light outlining her fragile figure. She greeted him with a soft smile, but he didn't return it. "I listened to the tape again," he said. Her hands froze on the blanket. "And? You were there, Veronica, not just waiting in the car. You were in the house that night." Her face tightened. For a moment, she looked like a cornered animal. Then her shoulders sagged. "I knew you'd find it," she whispered. He pressed on. "You whispered to them. You told them to do it. And when their plan failed, you finished it yourself, didn't you? You shot the girls while they slept, and then Robert. You staged the scene to look like a murder-suicide." Tears welled in her eyes, But she didn't deny it. "They couldn't have lived after what he did to them," she said softly. "You don't understand. Claire was pregnant. Anna, she had already tried once. And Julia, she was breaking. Every day was worse than the last. There was no saving them." Ethan felt the air in the room grow colder. "So you decided to kill them?" "I set them free," she said, her voice steadying. "I sent them to Linda, where they'd finally be safe. I thought they would go through with their plan, but when I realized they hadn't, I went inside. Robert was drunk, half asleep. It was easy. The girls never even woke up. I made it quick." Her hands trembled, but her gaze was unwavering now, almost serene. "I kept the photos, the tape, the diary, not to hide the truth, but to make sure someday someone would understand. That Robert Hargrave wasn't a victim. That the real crime started long before that night." Ethan's throat felt dry. "You could have gone to the police. You could have saved them." She shook her head slowly. "In 1978, a housekeeper, a woman in love with their mother, they would have laughed, or locked the girls away, or buried it. This was the only way I knew." The logic behind her words was terrifying in its clarity. She hadn't acted out of rage. She had acted out of a twisted, absolute conviction that death was mercy. Ethan ended the recording. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the room in a soft, gray half-light. Veronica closed her eyes, as if relieved that the weight she had carried for 42 years had finally been named. "I've been waiting for someone like you," she whispered. "Someone to finish the story." The arrest came quietly. In early 2021, detectives and state prosecutors reviewed Ethan's findings, the diary, the audio analysis, and Veronica's recorded confession. She didn't resist when officers arrived at Sunny Valley Retirement Residence. She simply nodded, as if the moment she'd been waiting for had finally come. Her trial took place that autumn. The courtroom was small but packed every day. Locals who still remembered the Hargrave tragedy, journalists from national outlets, even a Netflix documentary crew filming from the gallery. The prosecution presented Julia's diary, the forensic analysis of the cassette, the DNA tests proving Claire's pregnancy, and modern ballistic reports that contradicted the original suicide theory. Veronica's own voice on the tape, whispering instructions to the sisters, hung in the courtroom like a ghost. When it was her turn to testify, Veronica didn't deny a thing. She sat in her wheelchair, frail but unflinching, and described what had happened that night. Her words were calm, measured, almost gentle. She spoke of love for Linda, of the girls' suffering, of the hopelessness of 1978. Her defense argued that she had acted under extreme emotional distress, believing she was sparing the sisters further trauma. The jury deliberated for less than a day. They found her guilty on all counts for murders, but recommended leniency due to her age and the extraordinary circumstances. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. For Veronica, at 90 years old, it was effectively a life's end. The case made headlines across the country. Talk shows debated whether Veronica was a monster or a tragic figure. Survivors' advocates discussed how different things might have been if the Hargrave sisters had lived in an era where their voices could have been heard. Netflix announced a multi-part documentary titled Whispers in Willow Creek, using archival photos, the original tape, and Ethan's investigation as its backbone. Meanwhile, the Hargrave house, long abandoned, decaying behind chain-link fences, was finally demolished. In its place, the town council built a small memorial park. At the center stood a simple bronze sculpture of 3 girls holding hands, facing toward the hills. A plaque read, "In memory of Claire, Julia, Anna, and Linda Hargrave. May truth always find its way to light." On the day the park opened, people of all ages gathered. Some had known the family personally. Others had only heard the whispers. Flowers covered the base of the sculpture. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets, watching in silence. After the trial, he returned to Los Angeles, changed in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He had worked countless cases, But this one felt different. Not just because of its darkness, but because of how long the truth had waited to be found. He kept Julia's diary, carefully preserved, in his desk drawer. Sometimes, late at night, he opened it not to read but to remind himself why he did this work. Back in Willow Creek, the cemetery remained quiet. For headstones stood together in a shaded corner. Linda, Claire, Julia, and Anna. Every year, on the anniversary of their deaths, fresh flowers appeared. No one ever saw who left them. The Hargrave story had begun as a tragedy buried in silence. 40 years later, it ended with the truth finally spoken aloud. The past hadn't disappeared, it had simply waited. And when the time came, it rose to the surface, demanding to be heard.